All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us, Peter and John.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
So we wanted to kind of just delve into a bit of the preparation process for episode 2, which you guys know we'll be testing the Chinese brigandine armor against Asiatic warbows and Asiatic arrows, which is the main reason we wanted to invite you guys here, is to kind of share your experience as collaborators on the arrows specifically. So obviously, thank you so much first for helping us prepare for the test.
You're most welcome.
You're welcome.
So I figured we could just start with general introductions. You guys could just tell us a little bit about yourselves, your backgrounds, and what you work on. So Peter, you want to start us off?
Sure. I'm Peter Dekker. I'm a dealer in antique arms from mainly Asia. And I got in this trade actually as first a collector, then a researcher. And then I wanted to spend all my time actually doing this collecting and researching. And the only way I could see me doing that was buying and selling items. So that's what I'm doing as a full-time job now. But still, my heart is at research. So whenever there's some opportunity, or like now on the weekends, I'm researching my stuff again.
Great, great. John?
Yeah. My name's John Lamb. I've been making arrowheads for about 6.5 years now. I've made mostly European arrowheads, socketed arrowheads. Yes, I do make tanged arrowheads as well, as in this case. And yeah, I've literally made a lot of arrowheads in the past, quite a lot. Yeah, it's been, yeah, I enjoy making them. It's not my full-time job, but it's part of what I do.
So what was kind of your first impression when we approached you about making Asiatic arrowheads?
Well, the first thing was that they should have been tanged. I mean, I've made them before. The difference between what I found was the difference between European tanged arrowheads and Asian one is the Asiatic ones have a lot longer tang. I think they were about 100 millimeters, between 70 and 100 millimeters long, which is quite long. That's the main difference I saw. But basically, from a forging point of view, they're very similar. There's not a great deal of difference when it gets to the business end, to the point.
And now for people who don't know, do you just want to briefly explain what a tang is and how it differs from like a
sure
head, for instance?
Yeah, the tang is, well, it's the difference. A socket is exactly that, where the arrow shaft fits inside the socket. And a tang is where you forge the back side of the arrowhead down and form a shoulder. And then you reduce down to a very thin taper, and that taper goes inside the arrowhead. Instead of the arrow going inside a socket, the arrowhead goes inside the shaft of the arrow. That's the difference. That's what a tang is on an arrowhead, anyway.
And Peter, is that what you historically saw in kind of a region-based?
Yeah, it seems almost everywhere in Asia, the Middle East, they would use tang as the default. Sockets are seen, but very rarely. I would say less than 1% of the arrows that were made in these regions. Yeah. So Europe is in a way a little bit of the odd one out, so to say. Even the Vikings would use tanged arrowheads.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the Viking ones were a lot shorter tangs as well. I didn't quite, I think they're around about between 2 inches, I think, 2 to 3 inch. And the Asiatic ones are really long.
Yeah. Could it be because most of these heads we find are quite old, so they may have lost part of it?
Yeah, some of them, yeah. I've handled some original ones in a, well, I can't really mention where I went, but I've been in an archives and handled originals. Some of them look to have corroded away, and some of them look as if they were made yesterday. Yeah. And yeah, the tangs are shorter generally on like Viking, especially European and Saxon arrowheads.
Yeah, I ask because when I find old ones, so these are a couple of early arrowheads, you can see that the tangs are always quite short. But when you find a complete arrow, and I use a
Yeah.
magnet or the arrow that comes apart, it's
Mhm.
usually a lot longer. So the majority of the ones I've collected also seem to have lost some length over the centuries.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Sure.
it's the thinnest thing, of course. But it's hard to say whether some of them may have been actually made with a shorter tang as well. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
Mm.
Great. So I figured, Peter, we'd start with you. We could talk a little bit about the research process we went through and the sketching process. And figure we could start with some initial points of reference from illustrations depicted in Ming manuals. So including the Book of Archery, the Meaning of Archery New Book, and the Guide to Military Preparedness. So I'm going to share a couple of slides now, and just feel free to chime in and talk us through what you see.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll start with this one here, which depicts our leaf-shaped arrow, which is translated in the text, I believe, as eyebrow needle, and then the diamond shape we'll be using, which is translated as the armor piercing.
Yeah, I think for us, we wanted to draw inspiration from the historical Ming period because we practice a genre of Ming military archery ourselves. So we thought it would be nice to have something that was a little closer to what Ming archers would be using at the time.
So Peter, did you want to share any insights on these illustrations?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, these illustrations are always quite cartoonish when you compare them to antiques. So it's hard to replicate an arrow from one of these because usually the proportions are quite off. But luckily I've been living in Beijing for a while as a student, and a lot of farmers from around Beijing would find arrowheads in the ground, and they would come and bring them to the city in weekends to sell them for sometimes a pack of cigarettes or other things, or just a little bit of money. So it was a great way for them to make some extra with stuff they found in the field anyway. So I built up a collection of I think about 130 arrowheads, and there's quite a portion of them in there that are actually of this shape. And I know they're not Manchu because that's the main culture I study. The Ming was, of course, the culture before the Manchus, the main culture that would have defended Beijing at the time. So yeah, it's tempting to conclude that some of these arrowheads are in fact the ones depicted in these texts because they're not that much more corroded than the Manchu arrowheads I found in the area. So you'd think they would probably date from around the same time, which is the Manchu Ming Wars in the mid 17th century. And that is also not so long after the making of this, especially the Wu Beizhi, the Treatise of Military Preparedness. And so I can show you one of them. The armor piercing awl is most likely this one. Yeah, that's the one, the bottom one.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I'll bring up some, and these are from your personal collection, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
And these were reference points for the leaf here on top and the diamond shape, which we just referenced.
Yeah.
John, do you have any kind of impressions of what you see here when it comes to shapes and tangs, how it might contrast or share similarities with the stuff you work with?
Yeah, as is it the fourth one down in the picture? I'd say that's probably something that would pierce armor. If any of them have got a chance of piercing armor, that's the one. The one at the bottom, I'm not sure. The leaf-shaped one, they're quite stout, quite robust. So it's yeah, I've seen those and I've made them before in European. I've never shot them at anything. I've never shot them at anything hard, so I can't wait to see that. But they are similar in shape. They're also what I know it's his diamond section and cross section. They're not square, which is quite similar to European as well. which seems to be what I've seen a lot of in museums and archives. So yeah, there's quite some similarities there with European arrowheads.
And here we have another selection of kind of vast array of heads here. And I've just highlighted some chisel types up in the upper right-hand corner here.
Yeah, so the Chinese have been fighting the Jurchens a lot. And there is one account of, well, most accounts actually state that these would use chisel points. And this actually corresponds to finds of Jurchen graves, which often contain large amounts of chisel points of exactly this shape. And there's one account where one of them actually hit the jaw of general, I think, and they had to chisel away much of the bone to get the arrowhead out. So it was really, it got lodged into the bone.
Have you seen this similar shape, John, before?
I've made chisel heads before, European socketed ones, but they're quite different. Those are the first times I've ever made those. I've never handled a head that looks like that either in a museum, or I don't know if Europeans have ever made one that looked like that. But you know, again, it's quite a strong looking arrowhead. I'd be interested to see what that's going to do, to be honest.
And here one more time is a kind of selection of the antique versions of that heads we tried to emulate here.
Yeah.
So from here, Peter, why don't you kind of walk us through the recreation of these heads? And these are, of course, the sketches that eventually were sent to John to base the fabrication off of.
Yeah. Let me get an arrow to illustrate something. All right. Yeah, so this is a drawing of what I think one of my antiques would have looked like when new. And to make the drawing, I had to take into account that metal actually expands when it corrodes, and it can expand to astonishingly about 10 times as thick as it used to be. But this is, of course, when the entire object has corroded and turned into oxide. In this case, it was only the outer layer, so it wasn't that much expansion probably. Another thing I changed was the tang length, because as you can see, tangs on these tend to be quite short. And this is a Manchu head. And this is actually a fairly late type. This is only 19th century, but it had been somewhere in the ground where there was a lot of water, so it really corroded away. And what you can see here, that the tang is completely gone almost. This is what it would look like when new. Exact same head type. And this is the tang length. And the end is very thin, and then it tapers. So because a century in the wrong soil turned this into this, I figured the tang on this one is probably longer. And this will also help if the tang is shorter and the hit is not perfect, the arrow is more likely to break. So I thought in an armor piercing test, if you want to test the head performance against the plate, it's also good to have a little bit of a long tang, all within historical proportions, because tangs of 90 millimeters are also common among the Mughals, among the Japanese. So it was a tang length that is often seen in the region.
And now, John, what is kind of the importance of the length of the tang when it comes to durability?
Yeah, well, if you get I should imagine if you get an off-center hit and the arrow's not quite straight when it hits, the shorter the tang, it's going to force, like it's going to cantilever out of the arrow shaft. It could break the arrow shaft and the arrowhead could come completely out. So the longer the tang, the less likely that's going to happen.
Okay, great. And I'll just briefly show some of these other sketches. And John, if you kind of wanted to jump in here and start discussing what it was like to work off these sketches. Have you ever worked off sketches like these before? And, you know, just kind of what were the, what was the experience like?
It's I've worked to sketches before. But you have to remember, well, yeah, I'm using a hammer. You don't get it millimeter perfect every time. I've worked to sketches that I've done that I've got from museum archives that I've been in when I've weighed and measured, and I've scaled arrowheads. But those were European arrowheads. Forging these, yeah, the tricky bit about forging this type of arrowhead is forging the tang, getting the shoulder. It's not too difficult, but that's the hardest bit. The second bit about forging these sort of heads is, which would be the second bit in the process, because I like to forge the tang first, is wasting the neck to get the hourglass shape, and that's typically done over the horn of an anvil, and you angle the hammer, and you rotate the arrowhead as you're doing it. Yeah, then it's to get them exact. It's quite difficult to get to the exact size and shape on each arrowhead, but the ones that I've handled in museums, as I've said, I've only handled European, but there's no two exactly the same anyway. So it's, it did its job. It was there to do a job, and it did it. And you try to get as close as you can, really, to the drawings that I was given.
John, I have to say you did a fantastic job forging
Oh,
the heads that you did. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think we were all very impressed. And since you brought it up, we'll show some live forging action here, and you can kind of walk us through.
Yeah, I remember that well. That's really hot, that. You have plenty to drink. Yeah, that's I've got a coal forge, and I sometimes use gas. That one's my gas forge. Yeah, that's the process I used because it's, well, to be honest with you, it's more convenient to use gas. I can switch it on and get it up to temperature quite quickly. Yeah, that does get very hot, that one. That is a big burner in that gas forge. I can get up to welding heat in that. That's the rough forging of a tang. It's not quite finished. What I do after that step in the process is I'd take it and I'd hot file it to tidy up the shoulder, just to make it a bit more crisp. That tang is roughly, I'd say my anvil's about 4 inches wide, so it's about 100 millimeters long, that one. That's what I was talking about earlier about wasting the neck on the horn of an anvil. You're pinching in to create the hourglass shape that a lot of arrowheads have. It also helps. It kind of, you're not removing material by grinding. You're pushing material into the end, towards the point.
As you want to tell us a little bit about the material you used?
Yeah, sure. I used basically it's a basic steel. It's called EN9. It is 0.5% carbon, which means it is hardenable, but it's not silly hard. It's not like a tool steel. It's as we've discussed about steel. Yeah, I've used mid carbon, not high carbon, mid carbon, which was it hardens quite well.
You want to tell us just very briefly about the kind of hardening process and what that means?
Yeah, sure. When you're hardening steel, you're heat treating it. Basically, with the N9, you get it up to critical temperature, which I test with. When it gets to critical temperature, it's non-magnetic. When the magnet doesn't stick, EN9 you quench in oil. So I quenched those in oil, and the rapid cooling traps the carbon, makes it hard. It will form. It's basically a martensite. It'll form harder steel. It'll just go harder. It'll change its structure. But actually, before I harden, before I quench, sorry, I'll thermal cycle, and I'll heat it up, heat the steel up to critical, and then I'll allow it to cool slowly and shrink it. That shrinks the grain of the steel and makes it stronger. And then obviously you temper it. Those were tempered back to a dark straw, which softens the steel up again, because if you left it hard, it'd be like glass. If I hit it with a hammer, it'd shatter.
And Peter, how does this sound in relation to maybe some of the historical smithing you've researched?
Yeah, I think it's probably pretty much spot on, because especially in the earlier periods, the steel used for these arrowheads was usually also a lower carbon. Sometimes they would have inserted edges just like a sword with very high carbon, but those were only the highest quality heads. So the majority of the army wouldn't have access to them. In the Qing, there's this war where they sent, I think, 480,000 military arrows to the war zone, and only 20,000 special arrows for the bannermen that probably were forged like that. So very expensive as well. So I think in the Ming, that would also probably be similar. And some cultures, maybe like the nomadic cultures, may have had even more trouble getting enough steel than sedentary people. So I expect most of their arrowheads to be low carbon iron. And a lot of arrowheads we tested were actually not as hard as steel can be. So probably indicative of more of a lower carbon content as well. But also a lot of the plates would have similar issues, probably mostly iron as well. So probably the heads and the plates would be fairly similar in content.
Okay, and I'll just share a few more screens here, John, of the forging process.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one where it's just about finished forging and it's ready for grinding and pointing. That there is well, it's just after I've finished forging, really. It's cooling down. That's just before I'm going to thermocycle, and then I'd harden it, and then I'd slowly grind it to shape. Obviously, you don't want to grind it too much because you'll ruin the temper.
All right, and here we can see the finished product. Very impressive. And we then sent the heads over to John Potter, a master fletcher, who is your friend, I believe, John.
Yep.
He was unable to join us today, but he's going to send me some highlights about, you know, fitting the arrows. But if there's anything either of you would like to say about that process, feel free.
Yeah, there's not a single arrow that we know of that can be accurately dated to the Ming. Quite a difference with the Qing, where we have hundreds. But this would be a fairly typical construction. So you would have the tang inserted into wood and then wrapped, traditionally with sinew, but it could be any strong fiber. One of the main important things with a fitting like this is that where the tang ends in the arrow, that there's no open space, because then you basically have an arrow that's solid and then becomes a tube and then becomes tanked. The tank construction, of course, is very strong, and it will create a weak spot right behind the head. So that was one of the main concerns of these arrow makers, to fill that little spot. What I often would do is to heat it, so it would dig into the arrow and make a cavity, especially for it. Yeah, and I have some experience shooting these, especially the Manchu type. And the Manchu target heads, they have a plate basically, and I've shot them into a brick wall, and it was the wall that chipped and the arrow stayed intact. So that really showed me how impressively strong this connection can be if done well.
Okay, and Justin did perform a hardness test on the arrowheads and the armor. And what he came up with was an HRC rating of 65 for the armor and an HRC rating of 55 to 60 for the arrowhead. So it did appear that the armor was slightly harder than the arrowheads. Justin, you want to talk about that test at all?
Yeah, I was just using you know, a set of picks that are rated for testing different hardness levels. And what I was finding was that the hardest pick, the HRC 65 pick, it was starting to sort of bite into the arrowhead material. It was sort of starting to get a little sticky when I ran it across the surface, whereas it wasn't as sticky when I ran it across the surface of the plates. So that suggested to me that the armor plates were, around Rockwell hardness HRC 65, or maybe a little harder, and that the arrowhead was a bit softer.
Okay, and John and Peter, do you have any impressions there? And I guess maybe we can talk about official predictions.
To be honest, I don't really know what's going to happen. It depends on so many factors, because a lot of the Asian armor was the individual plates were not as high quality as European armor, but it's a system that works together. So you have the plates that actually move, and it's a bit like shooting an arrow into a curtain. It's the shockwave that goes through the curtain that actually slows down the arrow, and that's how a lot of these lamellar arrow armors work. A very quick slowing down of the arrow instead of completely stopping it, what plate attempts to do. Although even plate has some padding for this effect. Yeah, I don't know, the hardness difference between the arrowhead and the armor may or may not have consequences. That's also something hard to predict. One thing that's important is that the arrowhead can at least bite into the armor a little bit, so that the head stays in exactly the same spot for the entirety of its energy transfer. So when the shockwave moves from head to nock, basically. And that is more easily done when the plate is softer than the head, but it doesn't mean it can't happen. So that's something that will be very interesting to see whether something like that actually happens or that it slides. And of course, a lot really depends on the shot as well.
John, you want to chime in there?
Yeah, sure. Predictions. I'm not 100% sure, to be honest. I think armor probably works, otherwise they wouldn't have worn it, to be fair. Has anybody thought about concussive force? If the armor can move when it's hit, what are the forces behind the armor? Would that hurt the individual wearing it, whether it penetrated the armor or not? That's something that's interested me over, well, always. It's always interested me.
Yeah, and I think we briefly discussed an account of the kind of kinetic energy it takes to concuss and injure. Do you recall that number, John? I think it was 80 joules.
It's something like that. Off the top of my head, I'm not 100% sure.
So just to reference our measurements, so we will be shooting 110-pound plus bows, but of course, the real important factor is the kinetic energy, the energy of the moving object. And we are running at a rate of about 120 joules plus, depending on the arrow. So Justin, you want to talk about the importance of that?
Sure, yeah. I would just mention, I think, Blake, your setup, you've got 140 to 143 joules coming out of your bow. And with my setup, I've got the arrows coming out at about 120 joules. I think for me, momentum is at about 4.5 Newton seconds. So yeah, just to give you an idea of what the output is.
Very nice to see these arrows fly once more after some century of absence or more.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an amazing feeling, just in what little ways we can to walk in the footsteps of archers before us.